But I'm hoping you can share with us first, what is trauma? What is this and what does it mean to be trauma informed? That's such a buzzword today in our culture.
You know what? The reality is that we all have experienced trauma on some level. A lot of my work is more recently has been around racial trauma, but historically it's been trauma in general, and working with all sorts of population, kids through adults, couples, all of that. But trauma really is that we experience these things that range from what they call little t trauma to big T trauma. And so big T trauma being really huge traumatic losses. It could be a car accident, it could be something really devastating that we personally experience. And also some, I would say some vicarious things have happened even more recently that I would put in the big T trauma category. So the murder of George Floyd live, that's a big T trauma. So those of us who watched it, it was very traumatizing. And then you have little T traumas, which tend to be a little smaller, not as difficult. But these negative experiences, what happens is that our bodies and our minds respond. And there's a lot of work about how we hold trauma in our bodies. And and if we don't release that somehow, and I would say it's both. It's both our mind, but three things: spiritually, physically, and emotionally. I feel like we can hold trauma, and it starts to affect our relationships. It starts to affect ourselves, our bodies, our ability to sleep. We have a short fuse. We're um, frustrated easily. We're dealing with depression. We're dealing with anxiety. We're struggling with addictions. And all of that, we're trying to navigate like, what do I do with what's going on internally because of what happened? It was so traumatic. When we're dealing with racial trauma, it can be a big T trauma, but it can be these cumulative little T traumas that really add up. And science is saying that actually can do more damage than like a one big T trauma event. And so um, I think that people either have this backlash around the use of the word trauma, like, oh, yeah, everybody's traumatized. Um, but the reality is really about what that has done to that person. So we can't judge that. I can't say, well, that wasn't traumatizing. Maybe it wasn't traumatizing to me, but for that person, that experience, we don't know that person's whole life, the whole story. And so that one incident may be part of those, what we perceive as a little T trauma, but they've had multiple layers. And so what we're seeing in terms of their reactions and some of what we see on social media, where people are just their hair is on fire and just kind of not sure what that's all about. And it's because they've been carrying a lot for a long time, and there's a need to offload that. And it can be not just individuals, but we can also talk about communities, um, and not just in the U.S. but across the country. And we certainly saw that in 2020, where we were seeing eruptions everywhere. It wasn't just the US, it was across the world, where people who had been pushed under, pushed down, just were like, they were given permission to actually share. And even more recently, around Queen Elizabeth's death, like, there, Black Twitter, Irish Twitter was like, it was crazy. People were really, and I think that part of the issue with trauma too is that if there's no one there acknowledging that your trauma happened, and then you have on top of that, not only are they not even acknowledging it or seeing it, but then they're denying that it's even relevant or should be in the discussion. And so when we look at what happened around the world in 2020 and more recently with Queen Elizabeth, is that people who have been denied their voice or the reality, their felt reality, their historical reality, than to see something presented as in, that's not what that is, or this is a wonderful person. Yes, wonderful queen. However, there was a lot of damage that was done by the monarchy. That's an understatement. And so what bubbles to the surface is this wanting to deal with that pain in any way possible. And sometimes the quickest thing is anger, to try to exert that and get it out.
Talk to us about your book, Healing from Racial Trauma. Widely read book. What were some of the reactions to it? Why did you write it?
So I wrote it in 28, started writing in 2018. And I think that's what people don't realize. It didn't just 2020. It's like, this is the time to write the book. Um, we were living in South Africa from 2005 to 2016, and then came back to the US in 2016. So we came back and it was crazy time here. We just thought, and I grew up in Boston. I was bused to school. And so for me, it really felt like something had changed, something had shifted. And maybe because we're up north where people tend to mask a lot in terms of how they feel about different racial, ethnic groups. But it felt like the wheels were off and people were just saying and doing whatever pleased them. And then I was noticing with friends, family members, and even myself, as more and more incidents were happening in the media, and just this agitation and this sense of fear that I felt like was really mounting, and just this sense of really feeling like God was saying, "Okay, I want you to speak into this space right now." And it wasn't just about this moment in time, but I'd been working in the field for decades, and so I'm not unfamiliar with all kinds of trauma, as I said. But this specifically was focusing in on racial trauma, which I've had clients in the past who are BIPOC clients, and they were experiencing this and having to work through that. But this was different because it felt not felt it was more of a bigger global or community um, uh, trauma. And so I did a proposal and submitted that in 2018, and IVP ended up picking it up. And so fast forward to, and I've said this in other interviews, but I was initially upset because I thought IVP was going to release it in the fall of 2019, but they were like, no, we're going to release it in January of 2020. And I feel like it was clearly was God's timing, because it was literally like, okay, I think the first month it was like slow going, and then it just erupted in terms of people buying the book, and many people, lots of feedback of people just saying it was extremely helpful, it was healing for them, it brought awareness for them. And I think the other piece too is that because the book is not this just binary black and white issue, it really was looking at the way in which racism affects Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, biracial, this across the board. And so just the stories that were shared and just the journeys of the individuals just really met so many people where they were at. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I would also just say that in my book, it really, I my hope is to continuously point people to Jesus continuously. And I have been a practicing therapist. I'm actually not practicing now, but um, I know that therapy works, and yet I also know when Jesus is involved, and um, and I've experienced like a going deeper and a really getting at the core issue quicker when Holy Spirit's involved.